The Chargers GM was at the scouting combine today, and he had a lot of interesting things to say in interview. He was asked what he wants to do with the 5th overall pick, the cap situation regarding Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, and Mike Williams, as well as free agency and more. So make sure to like and subscribe if you do enjoy this content, bro. It helps me out so much. And now let's start off with this clip where he is asked about where the Chargers are in terms of evaluating players.
Yeah, we're making progress on it. Still kind of a work in progress. Staff just really got finalized last week. It's kind of a cross between installing the offense, installing the defense while evaluating the players, and that's natural because you're figuring out which players fit what we're going to do and how they're going to fit. And so that's players on our roster, players in free agency.
So the scheme that this coaching staff is going to have hasn't been fully developed yet, and that's actually a good thing to hear because now they have the opportunity to find players in the draft and maybe even free agency if they decide to be active there to build that scheme around. We heard Greg Roman talk just yesterday about how he wants to run the football, but how he manages to do that is going to change based on the personnel that he has. If you haven't seen my video yesterday, go check it out. There's a lot of good stuff that Greg Roman had to say. And this is, again, an example of that top-down synergy that this team has been lacking for a long time now. With how many coaches there are on Jim Harbaugh's staff, and everyone is going to get a say, I'm sure that you can make an argument for signing or drafting just about any player because I would be confident that the Chargers staff would find a way to use them. And also, here's what Joe Hortiz had to say about the players that are currently on the roster.
Yeah, I'll say this. The guys that are currently on our roster, I like all of the players. I mean, I think you find a role for them, and I think that's what we do is scouting. We find the things they can do for the team, and we do it in coaching. What can they do well for? So I don't think you eliminate any player. It's more of how they fit the team.
Finding a role for the players on your roster and getting players in your building that you can find a role for. Joe Hortiz has emphasized that he looks at what a player can do and not what they can't do. And then the coach's job is to put that player in position to do what they do well and not in position to be exploited by what they can't do well. Somebody better tell Brandon Staley that. Speaking of the players on this roster, here is what Joe Hortiz had to say about Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, and Mike Williams in regards to the cap situation.
We're talking through that still. We're still working through it. Obviously, the cap got bumped up a little bit higher than I think everyone was expecting, a little bit more. So gives us certainly some flexibility, a little bit more increased flexibility. So we'll kind of continue to talk through that over the next couple weeks and have a plan of attack shortly. Yeah, I think you look at a player's, look at a player's age. We do it in the draft even. I mean, it's, you talk about 30, whatever. You talk about 21 versus 25. You're always looking at it, but you also have to look at the production that they've had and that you expect them to continue to have. I think those are the things you have to weigh.
So with the increased salary cap, it really does give the Chargers a lot more flexibility in terms of what they're going to do with these three guys. And he's obviously being vague on what he is going to do because he doesn't want to give anything away, but he probably has had trade talks about every single one of those guys, Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, and Mike Williams. I'm sure that Joe Hortiz has an idea of what he wants to do, who he wants to keep and trade and restructure and extend and all of this stuff, but it's just remaining to be seen how it all is going to play out. And then with the age thing, he looks at the age versus the production, but he also looks at future production and if a player will still be able to produce the way that they have as they get older. I think if you look at Joey Bosa's age versus production, it's not as good as Khalil Mack's age versus production, even though Khalil Mack is older. So maybe that comes into play and they end up actually trading Joey Bosa but keeping Khalil Mack. I mean, I think it's easier. Well, it definitely is easier to keep Joey Bosa on this roster and trade Khalil Mack. But if all things were equal, money-wise, then I think Joe Hortiz, he would probably prefer Khalil Mack in this regard, and I honestly would too. But he is always working on the roster.
You're working to get the roster to where you want it every single day. I mean, certainly we're going to take a draft-centric approach, but, free agency, June free agency, signings right before August, turn in the roster during the season. The roster should never be where you want it. You're always trying to move ahead and get it. But yeah, we're going to continue to work to add pieces, but we're going to do it throughout the year. At all times of the year. In terms of the cap, I'm confident we can get there because you have to get there. You know, I have no choice but to get under the cap, so I can promise you we're going to do that.
Now let's see what Joe Hortiz has to say about Austin Ekeler and the running backs that are on the roster right now.
You know, Austin's a free agent. These guys have an opportunity. The guys that are currently on our roster, they have an opportunity, whether Austin's back or not. They have an opportunity to go out and prove themselves and grab a share of the offense, or grab an increased role, and that's what we want for them.
So Austin Ekeler, he's probably gone, and we all hope that he gets that big contract in free agency to help the Chargers out in that comp pick formula. But Isaiah Spiller, and specifically Elijah Dotson here, he had a great preseason, and I'm glad that he is saying that they're going to have an opportunity to prove themselves because they deserve a shot, man. And they're cheap running backs that you don't have to sign in free agency. They're also young.
Every position you have to weigh the opportunity, the surplus versus the value of the position. So, you know, running backs are important for an offense, and I truly believe that. I've been in Baltimore for 26 years, and running backs were extremely important, and certainly in Jim's offense and Greg's offense it will be. So the value placed on it, the monetary value, that's the things that we talk through and work through, but there is value in the running back position for sure.
And he talked about the value of the running back position and how important running backs are, which they are, but then he talked about their monetary value and saying it was something that they need to talk through and they need to work through. I thought that was funny because, yes, he does value running backs, but when it comes to paying running backs a large sum of money, that's a different story. And he said, you know, he was with the Ravens and they valued running backs very highly, but they didn't value specific running backs, okay? They valued a bunch of different guys at that position. And Joe Hortiz even said how important running backs are in Greg Roman's offense and Jim Harbaugh's offense as well. And he would know how important they are because he drafted guys for Greg Roman to use in the Ravens offense for years. But they never had a big money running back, and they always had multiple different guys in that backfield every single year. So yes, they do value running backs, but they don't value those big name running backs like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley in free agency this year. Don't expect those guys to come down. They value the lesser known backs that they can have 3 to 4 of every single year. He also said every single year you have deep position groups in the NFL draft, like offensive line and wide receiver.
It seems like there's players at every round, certainly in the offensive line. There's some other deep positions in the draft. You know, most years the same positions, but you know, wide receiver every year's, you know, starting to put out more and more wide receivers because the way college football has changed. So, but yeah, it's a good depth draft for line.
So with the depth at wide receiver and offensive line, who is Joe Hortiz going to take at 5?
No, you take the best player available because you're never, ever one player away. If you get a chance to take a special player at 5, you take that player. And then you work from there.
You heard him say it. If you have a chance to take a special player at 5, then you take that player. Now, obviously, that is if you stay at 5, because I still think that Joe Hortiz wants to trade down ultimately, because there will be an abundance of special players at 5. I mean, how many of you guys were thinking of Malik Nabers? How many of you were thinking of Brock Bowers? How many of you were thinking of Joe Alt? There's so many different guys that you could take. Even Terrion Arnold, some guys are probably thinking about. What they should do is trade down and then pick the guy who falls to you, because they're going to have a bunch of guys that are on their draft board that they view as a special player.
Building a team is managing a team, and it's the next year and the next year. So if you have to understand, if you take a player, you create great depth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you talk about having older players. What happens when one of those older players
get hurt right.
for a couple weeks, or what if the younger players get hurt? Now you have somebody to jump right in there. So you really don't want to pigeonhole yourself into one position because, man, we're weak at this position. I got to address this. I don't think that's the smart way. That's not the way I was raised
Okay, that's
to do
interesting.
It,
That's cool to hear.
Because you got to have depth all around. I think the best teams can overcome injuries,
right.
And how do you build depth? You're not afraid to add depth.
So building a team is managing a team. Injuries happen, and as Chargers fans, we know that. So what Joe Hortiz wants to do is build great depth, and part of doing that is not always drafting to your biggest need. And that's something that I felt like Tom Telesco did in the first round every single year, is draft to our biggest need. But Joe Hortiz said you don't want to get pigeonholed into drafting a specific position, and depth is always great to have. He said before that he wants to turn the bottom of that roster, and that's a big part of every great team, is having a floor of how bad some of your weaknesses are. And when that floor is higher, then your ceiling is going to be higher too, and you don't really have like a weak link in your chain that can just snap the entire chain. A lot of really good information from Joe Hortiz today, but there was also a lot of really good information from Greg Roman, the offensive coordinator, yesterday. So check this one out if you haven't already.